From our day-to-day life, we all know that a lot depends on how we set up things, in our work, in our living space, in our relationships. That setup later influences everything that's going on. The same applies to the world as a whole. How we set up our view of the world determines everything else we do in this world. In Christianity, the Book of Moses, by describing the act of creation, is making that setup. Only here, this is a setup of the whole universe, and also how that universe is related to God. And that then tells us a lot about God. And there we see the way in which God creates this world. The first and the most important thing is just the notion of this world being created by God. There are many consequences that arise from it. In the Book of Moses, we see that God is creating this world by saying the word, "Let there be." What that means is that the creation of the world is an act of God's will. That implies that created world, for example, doesn't come from the essence of God. So the world is not a part of God in any way. God simply wanted to create the world. But since the world is a product of God's will, it also means that the world didn't have to be created. God didn't have some kind of an urge to create the world, which he couldn't resist. God wasn't enforced into creation of the world, neither by something inside of him or something outside of him. It was an act of free will. That's why we can say that the very existence of this world and all of us was optional. It might have not happened. So the fact that we exist in the first place, we owe to God and his will to bring us to life, to existence. Next, an act of creation means that this world and everything in it, including a man, is not eternal, since it has a beginning. From the phrase, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep," later was formulated the phrase of creation ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. It's just something that both the description used and logical necessity imply. The words without form, void, and darkness are just a way to describe nothingness, since there is no accurate way to describe non-existence. The created world and everything in it received its being from God, and that means it doesn't have its being in itself. The being of the world was created out of nothing, and so it naturally tends to go back to nothing, to the state of non-existence. In other words, the world and everything in it is mortal. It has a beginning, and since it's mortal, it has an end too. Only it wasn't God's intention to have death be a part of this world, and we see that from the life of the first people. They were supposed to live in abundance and in unity with God, and they wouldn't experience death at all. They would forever live with their Creator. But humans are those who, by committing sin, activated mortality in the world. But the mortality was always inherent to this world. Sin just activated it. And we see that from the words that God says to the first humans. "If you eat the fruit from that tree, you will die." Here we see that God is not punishing them. He's not saying something like, "I will make you die," or "I will kill you." He is simply stating a fact that if they go their own way, they will die. That death is a consequence that will naturally occur. But the mortality of everything in this world is a simple consequence of the fact that this world is created and therefore mortal. As we talked about, that is so because the creation doesn't have its being from itself. It received its being from God. The world was created out of nothing, and if left to its own devices, it will eventually return to nothing from which it was brought to existence. The next thing we can notice from the Book of Moses is that for each step of creation there is a statement, "God saw that it was good." So this world and everything in it were created good, and should be as they are. There's nothing wrong with creation. But still, this doesn't mean that God's creation is immortal. Like we said, the created world and everything in it doesn't have its being in itself, it received its existence from God. That non-existence, or death, is the natural state of created world, And without God, it will go back to its natural state, to non-existence. And we see from the tale of Adam and Eve that death is something that eventually creeps into this world. But that happened against God's plan. It was a man's mistake, a sin, a man's doing, and it occurred in opposition to God's will. Although this happened through Christ's work, the act of creation gets its resolve, its fullness, when a Son of God becomes a man called Jesus. He dies on the cross, rises from the grave 3 days later, and shows himself as immortal. And this fits perfectly with the act of creation. Both the act of creation and Christ's resurrection show death as a problem, not as something intended. The way a man was created in his totality, body and soul, was the intended way. It was good, as God said. The death is the intruder here, a problem that needs a solution. And we also see the solution through the resurrection of Christ. So the most important consequence from the act of creation is that in Christian view of the world, there is an existential gap between a God and the created world. God is completely transcendent to all creation. He is unreachable in every sense, most importantly, existentially unreachable. Looking at it from human perspective, it means that no moral purity, no mental clarity, or spiritual heights can reach this God. Only God can overcome this gap and reach out to man, which he does when he sends his Son to become a man, Jesus Christ, and in him God forever binds himself to all creation. And by doing that, the creation gets its immortality from God.